Spencer Horne. Spencer did some research on group psychology, and he's titled his research Spoiled Choice. And some of you may actually have been a part of this. So we'll leave the rest to
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Spencer.
Welcome to our very first scientific research symposium. It's a real honor for me to open this symposium. But this evening I'll be speaking to you about a little experiment I did not too long ago on campus as part of my scientific research. And that experiment is on the science of social influence. And so what I've looked at is the way in which we influence each other, the sorts of influences we have on each other, and just how strong those influences can be. But the reason I chose to do an experiment is because to me that's really what excites me about science most. Reading up on things, doing the research is a lot of fun, but I'm really into the practical stuff. So it had to be an experiment. That was simply it. I want to start us off with a quote here, which is by Salvador Dali. And he said, "The secret of my influence has always been that it remains secret." And this is important to me for two reasons. The first being that many times we don't know when we are being influenced. In this case, I don't know whether I've been influenced by Dali or not, but according to him, I probably have been. The second thing is that I realized in doing this experiment, I would have to listen to Mr. Dali's advice here. And any influence I was going to have or create would have to remain a secret as well. And so the focus of my experiment, see why we're not going here. The focus of my experiment is looking at the extent of peer influence and also looking at whether that influence happens more easily in a positive direction or a negative direction, that being morally speaking. So whether we more easily influence each other in doing morally good things, or whether we more influence each other to do morally not so good things, or perhaps controversial or gray area sort of activities. And so, within my research, one of the big concepts that I've come across is that of social validation. There's a man called Robert B. Cialdini or Cialdini, who wrote an article, The Science of Persuasion, which is one of the big ones on which I've based my research. And he speaks about 6 different phenomena which can affect how easily we will be persuaded to do something for someone else. And the 6 are reciprocation, consistency, social validation, liking, authority, and scarcity. So examples are reciprocation, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I've done something for you, you're more easily persuaded to do something for me. In the case of authority, you're more likely to be persuaded to do something if the dean is asking you than if I'm asking you. So these are the various things that he's looking at. I'm focusing on social validation. And this is my little definition up there. I've said it's the motivation to do something because others do it. And so many of us may associate social validation with peer pressure. Now, first I'd like to differentiate between the two in terms of what I think of them. Many of us understand peer pressure, and I think it's usually used as a big umbrella term. But in my mind, peer pressure is feeling pressured into doing something, perhaps being motivated to do something, simply because others are doing it. Feeling pressured into doing something because it's a social activity. In my mind, social validation applies to already having the intent to do something, but then sort of being allowed or having the acceptance because it is a socially popular activity. So social validation can be used for many good things. And one sees it in various movements, things like recycling, We say we should recycle more. More people are recycling. It becomes cool to recycle, so we should recycle. That's social validation. Things like saving energy. It's Earth Day. Everyone is turning off the lights. We should turn off the lights too. Social validation. But unfortunately, when we tell people, lots of people are doing this, we validate it either way. So what often happens in campaigns that have to do with littering, committing suicide, cheating and stealing, is when we tell people, oh, littering is on the rise in the city of Johannesburg. Or, there's actually a specific study that was done on teens who were given information about the rise in suicide rates. And in fact, those teens were then more willing to take suicide or to consider suicide as an option out of their troubles or whatever the case may be. So what happens is, within social validation, when a lot of people are doing something, it tells us we're allowed to do that either way, whether it be good or bad. So we have cheating, stealing. I'm sure that people have been faced with situations where perhaps an entire class decides to cheat together on a test, and people are a lot more willing to do that when the entire class is doing it. And so, how was I going to measure this within an experiment on campus? Well, I could always ask people in a survey. The likelihood of getting an honest response if I asked you, what would you do if you were confronted with a certain situation, would be very low. People are very likely to lie, or perhaps they just don't know how they would react in that situation. And then the quote came back to me. Darling, so, I was going to have to somehow create an influence, measure it, and do all of that in secret. And the Brownie experiment was born. And so at this stage, some people in the audience will be going, ah, or, oh yes, that's what it was about. These brownies were in fact the element of temptation within the experiment. Well, I must say, these are not the real brownies. I had to look up this picture afterwards, simply because there weren't any left to photograph after the experiment. But I had my temptation. Something which everyone has the will to do, I'm sure, is to eat a brownie. Now we needed the influence. And so I said, right, we need perhaps a not so good influence and a good influence. And how we sort of weave this in together to be able to measure to what extent either one works. So at this stage, the experiment said we'll have randomly chosen individuals, coaxed into taking a survey, brownies nearby as a temptation, and in each group there would be planted people in order to exact that influence on the rest of the group. And so at this stage, the whole plan came together, and just over a week ago, in Mr. Peters' apartment, this is a very rudimentary picture, Paint, fantastic software, allows me to render this visually to you. This is the top view of Mr. Peters' apartment. The couches, the chairs, the big table he works at, and the plate of brownies, of course. And so the experiment involved having students randomly chosen out of houses, in their groups as houses, in groups of 6, going into the room, taking the survey, sitting at positions 1 through 6, where I placed the survey papers, and I'd instructed them, you have 5 minutes to complete the survey. You go in, you do it, you leave it on your seat, and you leave. And in each group, we had someone who was going to observe. In some groups, we had, one of the sorts of groups was a control group, in which we had a house with students with absolutely no influence. And they were just told to go inside, and I had an observer, and we looked at what they did with the brownies on the table set aside. They had received no information about the brownies, and the plate was meant to look like it had been half eaten. Maybe Mr. Peter had it out for guests earlier in the evening.